In this video, I will introduce a technique that will allow you as a front-end developer to create a beautiful, well-organized color palette for your design system by using CSS variables. You may have heard that the foundation layer of a design system is the atoms, simple components such as a button or a field. But there is another, more micro layer called design tokens. These are individual design decisions for things like colors, sizes, and fonts. Design tokens translate into CSS as variables. Let's say we have a primary brand color of blue, hexadecimal code 002C66. We can translate that into RGB or HSL. In this demo, I'll be using HSL to create my palette. HSL stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. I can leave my hue and saturation values alone, duplicate this shade, and change the lightness value incrementally. This gives me a full palette of shades in the same color family. How do we use this in our design system? Let's say we have a primary button whose background color is our primary blue. Buttons have multiple states, and the difference between them should be visually apparent so our visitor has feedback about their actions. For this, we can select different shades from our color palette. Since we created a full palette, we have plenty of colors for background and border variations to indicate our button states. Since every design system needs a neutral palette, I went ahead and created a set of grayscale shades as well. Let's build our palette as CSS variables. First, I will take each HSL value and assign it a variable name. All CSS variables start with 2 dashes. Next, we add an acronym for the design system we are building. Then we add the word color to denote what kind of variable it is. Then we add the color name. In CSS, we need to use literal color names, so stay away from the creative names for the moment. Next, I'll add a number that helps me to remember what shade this is. I like to use 3 digits and correspond them to the lightness of each shade. I add a colon, and then the corresponding HSL value, followed by a semicolon. I'll repeat this pattern for my blue and grayscale palettes. This variable collection is contained in a CSS file, and we call this our primitive variable layer. Primitive means original, variables named with their primary literal color names. But we still need to make our semantic layer so that we can use our colors consistently throughout our system. A semantic variable name is an alias for a primitive variable, a new name that represents how the variable is going to be used in our system. Let's create a semantic variable layer that we will use to designate our foreground and background colors. Just like our primitive variables, we start with 2 dashes, our design system acronym, and the variable type. Then we decide if it is a foreground, background, or border color. You can shorten background to BG and foreground to FG if that makes sense for your system. Next, I want to use a word to remind me that this is my general base background and foreground color. Now I'm going to reference a variable I created in my primitive layer. I use the text var followed by parentheses, and I put my primitive variable name inside them, followed by a semicolon. In a typical system, we'll have white or off-white for the background and black or off-black for the foreground. For interactive components such as links, we want to specify which state the variable is for. We will probably have a default link color and a hover link color. Some components have multiple variants, and we need to specify if it is the primary, secondary, or some other type of variant. Just remember that in variable naming, we go from most general, the design system name, to most specific. So for a button, I name the variant, design system, variable type, how the color is used, what component we are using it on, the specific variant of that component, the state of that component. So my default button background is --HW for my design system, color, BG, button, primary, default. And then I just changed that last term for each button state. I like to create a variable also for my focus indicator for a more consistent, accessible experience. Now, just like we did for our primitive variables, I will save these into a semantic light variables CSS file. Let's look at how these variables relate to our project file structure. I've got my project directory that would have an index.html file where my CSS file loads in the head tag. So I'm going to make a CSS directory with a style.css file in there. And I also like to make a vars directory to put all my variable files in. In my CSS file, I'm going to do an import of my primitive variables file, followed by an import of my semantic variables. When I build my base styles, I'll set my body background color to my base background, and my foreground to my base foreground color. Then I'll add my default link color and my hover link color. In my button component CSS file, I'll use the variables that I set up specifically for my button colors. I tested out my base, link, and button variables and confirmed that I have accessible color contrast ratios. Now I can build my dark mode variables. For dark mode, I will invert my base background and foreground colors, so I have a dark background and light foreground. And I need to lighten my link colors so they'll be accessible on a dark background. And my button colors can stay the same. I'm going to save my dark variables into their own CSS file. And in this one, I'm going to nest a media query for prefers color scheme dark. This detects the prefers color scheme setting on my visitor's computer and adjusts to respect their preference. Let's add our dark mode variables file in our variables project directory and import it into our style.css file under our primitive and light mode variables. I tested this out in my browser and verified that my colors switch when I have prefers dark mode set to on in my preferences. Thanks for watching this introduction to how to create a color palette for your design system using CSS variables. For ways to connect with me, visit my website, lunarfusion.com. Feel free to reach out.